Hello, and welcome to this IDC Manufacturing Insights Global COVID-19 webinar. As we know, there's been a lot of challenges and issues facing global supply chains over the last few weeks and months. And what we'd like to do today is to really take you through some of the opportunities and actions that organizations can take to really focus on improving their supply chain, both in the short term and also starting to think about the longer term. With me today, we have four of IDC Manufacturing Insights analysts. We have Simon Ellis, who's Program Vice President for Global Supply Chain Strategies based out of the US. We have Stephanie Krishnan, who's Research Director for IDC Manufacturing Insights, Asia Pacific, based in Singapore. We have Jan Burian, who's Research Director for IDC Manufacturing Insights in EMEA, based out of the Czech Republic and the UK. And Remy Glazner, who's Research Director for IDC Manufacturing Insights Robotics, also based out of the US. And my name is Chris Holmes, and I'm Managing Director for IDC Insights Asia Pacific, also based out of Singapore. So with that, I'd like to actually ask the first question to Simon. I mean, manufacturers and retailers today are justifiably worried about the future, but they're also really worried about today. What are some of the things that they can do immediately, do today, that they can actually, to address some of the challenges that they're actually facing?
Thanks, Chris, and hello, everybody. You know, it's an excellent question because, you know, while I think the sort of the longer term learnings of what's been happening in the supply chain will emerge over time, that doesn't help companies today, right? So the question is, you know, based on supply disruptions, at least initially, but also kind of the impact on demand, I think companies are rightly saying, okay, you know, what can we do today? What can we do now? And you know, to a degree, the choices are somewhat limited, right? I mean, the wholesale replacement of technology is perhaps not really not really possible in the very short term. But there are some things you can do. I mean, one of the things we saw out of the financial crisis of 2008 was the companies who had invested in more modern technology, you know, tended to be able to survive impacts, tended to be able to survive disruptions with a bit more agility, with a bit more success. And I think the same is true here. I've had a number of companies talk to me about needing to, enhance and increase their investment in cloud, right? So the ability to, you know, manage change and manage rapid change within cloud environments is certainly better than more traditional on-premise investments where, you know, in some cases, you know, maintenance may have been suspended, or you know, these are old, highly customized applications, and just aren't particularly good at being nimble and being fast. So I think this idea of, you know, let's see what we can do in terms of the cloud in the very short term, I think is certainly possible. You know, I'm a big fan of ecosystems, right? So I've written quite a bit over the years about this idea of a multi-enterprise supply chain ecosystem, and that is something you could do tomorrow, right? I mean, you can join ecosystems, whether they're industry based, whether they're domain based. You can join ecosystems tomorrow, and I do think that, you know, as we think particularly about what's been happening with the coronavirus in the supply chain, you know, it's largely happened everywhere, right? So traditional, you know, strategies of diversification, you know, haven't helped as much because no matter where you may have diversified to, it's part of everywhere. So, but if you're a part of an ecosystem, you're collaborating in real time, you know, I think there are opportunities to seize on something that may be available today but not tomorrow, that you know, helps you navigate through. Artificial intelligence, not to sort of, I know AI is sort of the bright shiny object in many ways in the supply chain these days, but I do think, you know, if you think about artificial intelligence as, you know, sort of that last most sophisticated end of the analytics continuum, I think the degree to which you're using analytics in the supply chain and sophisticated analytics in combination with perhaps participating more in ecosystems than you have in the past, I think that, again, it allows you to react faster. It allows you to move faster. And I think in today's supply chain, being able to move fast is really important.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to just move on to Stephanie. I mean, because we've here in Asia, we obviously saw the problems start to arise in China at the end of last year, and obviously China was the first country to actually be hit. And obviously they had issues around the supply chain. We had workers not being able to go into the factories. We had workers not returning home after the Chinese New Year holiday. But as things have started to return to some level of normality, where factories are reopening, consumers are starting to appear back on the streets. We've seen that obviously from the local demand, but obviously as the virus has spread, we've now seen issues on demand in coming from the US and coming from Europe. So, I mean, what are you actually seeing in terms of this change around the fact that we've moved from the supply chain disruption now to the demand disruption?
Well, this is classic where we're starting to see the movement of demand actually affecting the Chinese consumption, but this is having a dual effect. So on one hand, you're seeing massive layoffs where organizations are actually starting to lay off their employees because they just don't have the orders to take up the production. But at the same time, you're starting to see pivots where companies are starting to redirect some of their manufacturing efforts to more required capabilities, where you might see car parts or beauty products start producing masks or hand sanitizers. And this is having the effect of actually taking up some of that slack and actually being able to use some of that production for, worthwhile or much needed capabilities, as opposed to looking at, what they would traditionally do. And so that ability to pivot has really boded well for companies. I had it asked to me the other day, how does a car manufacturer actually do that sort of pivot? How do you go from, making car parts to making ventilators? And there are collaborations that are starting to happen where, the likes of Fiat or their partners here are actually working with ventilator manufacturers. And the design impetus is coming from the medical device, the manufacturers there. But they've actually had the ability to look into their supply chain and say, hey, we actually have commonality in some of the parts that we use, whether it's the springs, whether it's fans, whether it's tubing, right? And actually be able to say, okay, instead of ordering tubing that's compatible for driving or for vehicles, now I'm ordering tubing that's compatible for medical device manufacturing. And I'm actually able to pivot my production based on having that visibility into my supply chain to then be able to use that supply base to then source to meet current demand in a market that I may not necessarily have traditionally looked at. So there's that aspect of it which is starting to be echoed, and we're starting to see that echoed in some of the production choices being made in the US as well. So there are lessons that are being learned, and because of the nature of the internet and the fact that we're all online at the moment, we're actually able to make those choices and echo those choices rather rapidly around the world. Some of the things that are not so easily echoed is where we do have traditional supply chain set up, where actually having that demand, I'm seeing companies like Walmart and Amazon minimizing the selection. So the variety reduction is actually reduced significantly as they put emphasis on, basically putting us on a war economy kind of footing where, guys, we need to get the essentials through. We're not going to stock the variety that we had it before. And of course, that's having a knock-on effect where a lot of that is sourced, which is in Asia. Similarly, though, some industries are going gangbusters. Thai rice, for example, I think is 5 times the price it would normally be at, right? The demand for it is just extraordinary. But the transportation issue is the thing that's preventing a lot of that coming out. So there are a number of different variables that are at play here. Looking at the transportation aspect, looking at the ability to pivot, looking at, demand variety reduction. We talk about the bullwhip effect, and we're definitely going to see that over the next 2 to 3 years.
So, I mean, again, one of the interesting things is we've seen this sort of almost panic buying start to occur, particularly for some consumer products. I mean, the classic one in Asia has been toilet rolls, where all of a sudden there was a shortage of toilet rolls in China, then it moved across ASEAN, then it moved down to Australia and New Zealand. So how are manufacturing companies really responding to this sort of, suddenly you've got a nice steady supply chain, you know what the demand is, you know how much to produce, and then suddenly you're seeing these huge spikes in demand. I mean, how are companies managing this in today's environment? And again, how are they really sort of embracing some of the newer tools to really sort of cope with this?
So having, again, that visibility into the supply chain, so having that connectivity to be able to do that is key, but having that both ways. I actually just got an email from my supermarket in Australia this morning. I still get emails from that supermarket, even though I left quite a few years ago. But they were saying they're still having issues with constraints in toilet paper supply, and would consumers please still be patient? Unfortunately, there are constraints in actual production. There's constraints in the transportation that's bringing that through. Unfortunately, Woolworths and companies like them actually have the visibility up the supply chain to see where these constraints are. That's something that they've set up pretty early on. They were, some of the first, along with Walmart and similar, some of the first adopters with RFID and having those sort of supplier portals that allow them to basically track that sort of capability. Going into transportation management systems, being able to see suppliers and track at PO level exactly what's coming through the supply chain can be quite key to the retail environment in that instance. From a manufacturing point of view, though, it can be quite challenging. In a lot of cases, you're relying on distributors who may or may not have that level of sophistication. I was talking to a pharmaceutical distributor this week, and they're really struggling with having that sort of visibility, because it's not just dealing with large chains that are putting out medicines for them, but they're having to deal with small mum and pop medical facilities and doctors. You've got the doctor who's running the facility in the Philippines, and the wife is the admin that keeps all the medical records and is in charge of all the medicines. And they certainly don't have the level of sophistication, and that's where some of the visibility actually breaks down. So having that sort of visibility, being able to put those sort of portals in place that allow very low end shops to be able to actually integrate into those sort of systems. So we're starting to see in Singapore, for example, with retail, iPad-based inventory systems that do allow for that sort of integration, putting it on the cloud, being able to update that in real time. That sort of connectivity is actually driving better visibility in the supply chain. And once you drive that sort of visibility in the supply chain, then you are going to be able to flatten out some of those shocks. Whereas traditionally, the bullwhip effect is called that because you end up with these huge shocks because you don't have that visibility. So it's all about driving visibility.
Hey, Chris, could I weigh in on that for a moment? Because one of the things that we've seen in supply chain now for a number of years has been this sort of gradual increase in demand volatility, right? You talk to most large manufacturers and they would say, well, my forecast accuracy is maybe as good as it was 5 years ago, but maybe it's not. And demand volatility has been in many ways the big driver of that. One of the things that will be interesting to see, I agree with Stephanie, all your observations, but one of the things that will be interesting to see is over time whether coronavirus kind of kicks demand volatility to that next level. And I've certainly argued for years now that I think companies spend too much time on trying to get to a perfect forecast, which, oh, by the way, you'll never get to. And what they should be doing is they should be investing in resiliency, right? They should be investing in supply side flexibility, so that if a demand spike hits that is not anticipated, that's a good thing because I'm going to sell more, but my supply chain can respond to that more quickly, even though it wasn't something that I necessarily forecasted. So I think that will be interesting over time to see whether forecasting takes a somewhat of a back seat to being able to be more responsive.
I couldn't agree with you more on that, Simon. I'll counter to that, because we were having a conversation this morning where we're actually saying that maybe this economies of scale drive for production is not the way to be, right? Looking at smaller production runs, pushing to a more network model of you're talking about pushing manufacturing closer to the point of consumption. That's certainly something that could happen.
And I think that's very interesting because we can also start to talk around some of the newer technologies. And I mean, things such as additive manufacturing, where suddenly you've got one piece of equipment that can produce multiple different types of products. You know, we don't really need to go into all the, setting up factories with particular tooling. We have a lot more flexibility. So again, I mean, I think that's going to be more longer term, though, in that adoption. Again, I mean, has anybody seen anything otherwise from companies taking more direct response in terms of actually investing in some of those newer manufacturing technologies?
Yeah, I don't know that I've seen that yet. I mean, I think one of the things that I just saw an article this morning, for example, that Japan is planning to invest significantly in less China, right? And so, is that reasonable? Is it, certainly global diversification is important. Maybe not all that effective when the pandemic is everywhere, but global diversification is important. But what's an overreaction versus what's a reasonable reaction? And I don't think we really know that yet. I'm with you. I mean, I've thought for years that this idea of localized additive manufacturing specifically is a really interesting alternative to same day delivery, right? You same day make. But I'm not sure yet. I think we have to see a little bit about what are reasonable reactions and things that make sense versus those kinds of inevitable, I think, short-term overreactions.
Well, there have been two actual examples of organizations using 3D manufacturing to modify the scuba masks to make ventilation-capable devices, which is one way of adapting an existing product. I think Decathlon was the one that actually brought that out. But in terms of the large-scale production of things, we're actually seeing a lot of makers step forward. So there's been some adaptation with regards to helping the frontliners with regards to their masks and having a little adapter that comes at the back of their head that stops the strain on the back of the ears. And there's a huge force of makers, your backyard hobbyists that are turning their 3D printers into quite strong production facilities to help, or bring these about locally. So I think there's a lesson to be learnt there in terms of the distribution of making. And I think that's something that could be picked up quite rapidly.
Yeah, I think it really depends if it's B2B or B2C, right? So it's quite a big difference, right? So because we saw that, it was earlier this year when Adidas, they shut down their production of their two speed factories. One was in the US, one in Europe. And they moved the production into China, right? To China. So because that's where the market is.
So Jan, while you're speaking, my next question is actually addressed to you. And really, Stephanie started to introduce this idea of sort of pivoting, being able to sort of retool factories, being able to, shift from making one product to another. And again, I suppose this goes both to what we've been seeing in Europe and also what we've been seeing in the US, where, there's been instructions from the government to sort of, for automotive manufacturers to switch over and start to manufacture medical equipment. How do you actually go about that? The other example we've seen is sort of perfume manufacturers go into making hand sanitizer and beer producers making hand sanitizer. So, how do factories really start to think about what they can actually do to respond? And again, I suppose it continues also with this theme we've actually got, talking around here, this notion of being able to change, being able to adapt, and basically being resilient to respond to actual demands.
Yeah, what we see here in Europe, the companies are doing pretty well actually when it comes to this, let's say, rapid change over of their production programs. And I think that the answer is the collaboration, right? Because most of these companies, they collaborate with each other. Like, for example, Jaguar Land Rover in UK, they are collaborating with NHS, right, with that medical system, and with the scientists as well, with the vendors of the 3D printers, for example, and then they are able to create a new product, right? Or Volkswagen is cooperating with Airbus, right? Airbus is designing the protective shields, the face shields, and Volkswagen is producing these shields, right? So we can see many examples, or even like a intercompany cooperation, like Sandvik, which is a producer of like industrial devices, and then they are, I mean, the different divisions, they are teaming up together, and so they are teaming up with their education centers. They have also their own education centers, and they also developed, and now they are manufacturing new types of the masks, right? So I think that this is the answer, right? To have that collaboration in place, and of course, because on the one side there are the engineering, there's engineering perspective, right? Engineering angle, because somehow someone has to design thing, and the thing should be also tested as well, right? Because no one would like to, use a ventilator which doesn't work 100%, right? So it's one thing. The other is to find a capacity for that, and of course to work with and to have a supply chain in place, right? Because there are a lot of parts which the companies are not able to develop or to produce by themselves, right? Even if we see, like, for example, Volkswagen, they are able to 3D print these like the smaller pieces of the face shields, and then and even the foil, and even the protective foil, they are able to manufacture by them own. So I think this is also good example how companies are coping with that situation. Also, what we see, I mean, so one thing is how to reach the flexibility in production. It's collaboration. It's using of this additive manufacturing, but also robotization and automation comes into place. And we also see some very nice examples of how companies were able to very rapidly to change their production line to be 100% touchless. So they just brought together the system integrators, the robotic companies, the companies which provided safety parts to the production line, because it's not just about the production itself, right? There still should be some safety pieces implemented into the whole production layout, right? So and they are able really within like 1 week to build up a production line which is now creating filters for these respirators, for example, right? So I think this is definitely the way to go. And what we also see that because it's not, I mean, when we are talking about the respirators, ventilators, this type of stuff, is more like a discrete manufacturing, right, style. But when we talk about, for example, some clinical tests, right, or development of some of the drugs, right? So of course there should be like a lot of testing, a lot of calculations. And I'm coming back to the discussion before, like about the working from home and using a cloud. So we see also the many initiatives driven by these like a CAD/CAM vendors, or these companies who are providing this type of like testing tools that they are, let's say, given for free, or opening the softwares for a certain period. And so the scientists and the engineers are able to work with these tools from home, and so they are not using a VPN or something like that, because it's then it's very, from a capacity perspective, it's slowing down servers significantly.
Okay, so I just want to come back to you. You initially started talking around this notion around different companies coming together, and I think that touches on what Simon was saying earlier on about these ecosystems. I mean, how have you seen really these ecosystems actually come together? Has it been sort of government initiatives or industry initiatives? What's been one, the almost the catalyst that's bringing these different parties together?
I think it depends. It's company to company, of course. In the case of, for example, that Jaguar Land Rover, there was I think that it was more like a government driven, right? But but some manufacturers, they just want to help. They see that they have their capacities and free capacities because their factories are shut down at the moment. But they also understand that they are, for example, don't know they could probably develop the ventilator or face shield by themselves, but it's gonna take them quite a lot of time. So they are trying to create these collaborations spontaneously. And I can give also quite interesting example of how Siemens is helping in this situation, because Siemens got a additive manufacturing something like a portal thing, and there are, let's say, number of additive manufacturing providers, like companies are providing 3D capacities of 3D printers, but also designers, and also the customers can be the part of this ecosystem, and they can easily find a company or provider who would print the requested part for them, right? Mm-hmm. So, and Siemens has opened that platform for free, for all these participants, so they can really easily be exchanging information and also could helping each other when they, for example, if there's a company who doesn't know any or doesn't have any own capacity, they can use that portal and easily find someone.
Thanks, Jan. So, I mean, we've started to touch on some things such as what's actually happening on the shop floor there. And obviously, one of the big challenges that we faced with the virus is suddenly the fact that we couldn't actually have people, within 2 meters of each other. For some of the production side factories, this has been a huge problem, because suddenly you just don't have the workers to actually do the assembly tasks, to run the warehouse, to deliver parts throughout the factory, throughout the plant. So again, I mean, and before the crisis, we saw there was a growing interest in sort of automation. So Remy, maybe you can just sort of touch on what you're actually seeing in terms of people talking about automation, and whether you see it's almost a short-term solution, or maybe it's a longer-term solution, because again, one of the issues with putting automation in is it's typically taken a fair amount of time to actually do it, commission it, etc. So maybe you could just share with us what you're actually seeing in this aspect.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Chris. So first of all, automation, the topic of automation and robotics has been really on the rise with the COVID-19 crisis. I cannot start telling you how many requests and inquiries I'm getting on a daily basis about that. It's like, well, the weak link today is people. So how do we replace them with robots? Is it possible? How do we do that? So the first thing is those type of questions, they existed before the crisis. Labor challenges were existing. People, in warehouses, it was difficult to find them. On the shop floor, it was the same thing. Like, how do we find them? How do we retain them? So should we use more automation? And the answer was yes, but it was basically usually seen from a very tactical and local perspective. So it's really, I'm a warehouse manager, I'm a factory manager. I cannot really find the people. I cannot retain them. I need them to be a little flexible. So I will use automation for, kind of like the short-term perspective. Now with COVID-19, what we're seeing, and it's pretty striking, is the people who are asking questions about automation are not the same. they're not anymore local and tactical people. It's moving really from that local perspective to something much more strategic. Is how do we actually make our supply chain? How do we actually make our production floor more resilient and capable to absorb, high spike in demand or, a request or anything? And how can we retool those machines very easily? Can those machines actually bring some intelligence into the entire supply chain ecosystem or ecosystem that we're playing with? And in that respect, it's a lot about, considering robotics and automation, not just as, one-off system that you add to the technology mix, but really as system that will really integrate into the data-centric environment that we're seeing growing more and more.
Fantastic. So again, I think we're going to see a growing adoption of automation and robotics, in the near term and the longer term.
Absolutely. But one thing that people should really understand is you won't see that overnight. It's not necessarily a long-term play, but it's not a short-term play either. As much as you can find some robotics and automation solution provider that will come and say, well, you can basically deploy those robots in your factory or in your warehouse in a matter of hours. It's possible. If you really want to tackle a very short-term, very local hurdle, that is possible. That does exist. It starts to exist. Now, if you really want to integrate that and make them part of your, advanced supply chain capabilities, it's more for the near-term, mid-term kind of play. So think of it through months, not years, but months at least, not weeks. So will robots actually solve the COVID-19 problem? Probably not. But could they be able to solve or absorb the next crisis we'll see? Yes, I think a lot of people are actually working on that and making that a possibility.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for that, Remy.
If I could just add to that, Chris, sorry, before you go on, is, Remy's absolutely right. And we saw this in an IDC talent survey last year, that the talent crunch was actually getting to the point where manufacturers and supply chain professionals both were looking at automation to top up the capabilities of people. I think what we're seeing in ASEAN in particular is the use of robotic process automation and intelligent software automation to fill in some of that gap as well. Not just addressing the physical aspects, but also addressing some of the informational aspects of it. We've had situations where data hasn't been updated in a timely manner, not able to get data from on system to on cloud, where they could actually then take advantage of automation rules where if shipments are cancelled, then they can rebook instantly on other shipments, on other routes or other modes of transport, which has resulted in shipments being delayed not just by hours or days, but in some cases weeks. So I think in terms of robotics, Remy's absolutely right. It was a problem before, but it's something that's going to push itself into the software realm, which may be actually faster to take up rather than some of the installations that might be required.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stephanie. So I just want to ask Simon really the last question, and it's really around, you've been a supply chain analyst for a fair number of years now, and really, what have you seen that's, what have companies who have come out of this better than others done? Of all the organizations you look at, some have responded much faster, better, quicker, whatever you want to use, to the scenario that's been thrown at them this time. And what are the things that those organizations have actually done that's made them sort of stand out? Maybe you can just talk around that.
Yep. No, it's a really good question to close with, Chris, right? We were having a conversation the other day with a company who had a pandemic plan in place, and I thought to myself, and I asked the gentleman who the head of their supply chain. I said, well, how did you know? He said, no, don't misunderstand. We had a World War plan in place. We had a pandemic plan in place. We had a climate change plan in place. And the point wasn't, at least his point wasn't that it was necessarily a pandemic plan, but they had plans, right? They had infrastructure and capabilities in place so that maybe they could anticipate or maybe they could be in a position to react faster, right? I wrote a report many years ago about risk and resiliency in the supply chain, and the argument that I made was, you can pre-qualify redundant suppliers, you can do all kinds of things in terms of sort of actively and proactively mitigating certain problems, but some things will happen that you don't anticipate, and the key capabilities there really are the ability to move fast, right? There's a couple of companies out there that offer visibility services, right? Risk management services where they send out alerts. There was one company that was sending out alerts back as far as November, saying there was a curious new form of pneumonia that was popping up in Wuhan, right? So if you get that, and it goes back to Stephanie's point about visibility, if you get that kind of information, you don't want to overreact, but it allows you to put capabilities in place that when it is required, when it is necessary for you to move fast and nimbly, you can. And this one company said, we think about this in terms of, if we react so quickly to something, it almost looks like we anticipated it, right? Even though we might not have, because we moved so fast. If you have a major disruption in a particular industry, the companies that move fast will take advantage of limited alternative, right? Whereas the companies that are slower will find that those alternatives are already taken. So I think it's about having plans in place. It's about having, it's about having the structural capabilities so that when things go wrong, maybe you anticipated some of them, maybe you didn't anticipate some of them, but when things do go wrong, boom, you can act on it fast, you can act on it quickly. Limited, we've all seen over the last 20 years how, lean processes, just-in-time inventory, in some ways, those things were a disservice this time around, right? If you happened to be, a less efficient manufacturer and you had a ton of inventory sitting around, 10 points to Gryffindor for dumb luck, right? It's just, you were in a position to be fortunate because you happened to be less efficient in terms of how you managed inventory. So, the learnings will be interesting, but I do think planning and having structural capabilities in place to react fast and leverage, again, I'll use it, ecosystems will show to have been really important in terms of companies who fared better than companies that did not.
So that sort of scenario, that sort of a simulation type of efforts.
Yes.
And actually, I need to ask you the question because we've seen an awful lot of interest in the digital twin, and we can talk about the digital twin of the process, of the supply chain process. And I think, being able to actually have that and then throw scenarios at it and then look at the response. Do you think that's maybe one of the uses of the digital twin going forward?
Yes, yeah. I'm in the process of writing a piece around this notion of supply chain orchestration and, control towers and digital twins being a critical component of that. You asked before about working from home, right? the companies who have most seamlessly moved to effectively working from home are kind of the ones that were doing it before, that had the capabilities, had the corporate culture in place already. And I think that analogy works here too. Companies who had that kind of corporate culture in place around resiliency and around, risk management in terms of, mitigation in some cases, fast response in others, those are the ones that will take to it more naturally and more easily. And when you've got hours or days to make the right decision, companies who have that structural capability in place will make better decisions in hours and days than the ones who do not.
Yeah. That's an interesting one because, again, it's also even looking at that decision-making process, who needs to be there to make the decision.
Yes.
Because these are going to be very, very big decisions, what are we going to make? Who are we not going to supply to as much as who we supply to? So
and who can make those decisions quickly? It doesn't have to be I think perfection is the enemy of good enough, right? I think in some of these cases, you need a structural capability in place that you can make good enough decisions in hours and days,
Yeah.
we'll worry about whether they, whether they were perfect down the road.
Brings me to my final sort of set of comments that I'd like to get from all of you. I mean, we've had a fairly wide-ranging conversation around, the key challenges and the key takeaways that companies can and the key learnings that we've seen through this current period. But maybe what's the one thing that stands out? And perhaps if each of you can just sort of give me the one area of focus, the one learning that you would encourage other organizations to take away, what would it be? And let me ask Stephanie first on that.
In terms of the action to take forward, I think building that visibility up and down the supply chain is going to be key. And regardless of whether you're using data and pulling it in from spreadsheets or starting to gather a single point of truth where you can actually start making actionable decisions from your insights, I think that's going to be key. Start now, that it's not too late. Bottom line.
Thank you. Jan?
Yeah, in manufacturing, there will be a collaboration and the ability to transfer the data into the insights, right? And to increase this ability to, let's say, react on time, right? Not to hesitate too long, because of course, especially area which are labor intensive should be focusing on this.
Fantastic, thank you. Remy?
Yeah, I would just say that when it comes to automation, integrating automation is not just about adding automation or robotics to the technology mix. It's about really rethinking through the overall supply chain digitization.
That's great. And Simon, your parting comment?
Yeah, I agree with Stephanie. I mean, I think we've always said with metrics, right? You can't improve what you don't measure. I think you can't react to what you don't see. So visibility is critical in the short and medium term. There's a lot of things that companies can do. I do worry a little bit though about overreaction, right? Sort of people still need jobs, right? People still need work. And while I agree with Remy that I think we will see an increasing interest in service robotics, people still need jobs, right? I think we should view technology as augmenting people, even though in some cases it replaces them, but it should be largely augmenting people. But no, I'm with the visibility. If you're going to be a more resilient, more nimble, more agile, all these sort of similar words, you've got to know what's happening, and you've got to know what's happening, accurately in real time. If you don't, I think you're going to find yourself, underperforming supply chains who do have and have developed those capabilities. So that would be my kind of closing comment.
Thank you, Simon. So with that, I'd just like to thank our presenters, Simon, Stephanie, Jan, and Remy, for their discussion and their input today. And for further information, IDC has a plethora of COVID-19 research that has been produced, looking at everything from technology spend, but also how different industries are responding, manufacturing, retail, utilities, etc. That can be found. We've also got access to all of our manufacturing research, again, looking at what's happening across supply chains, manufacturing operations, product innovation, and again, that's spread across the globe. And then I've also, if anybody has any questions or comments, please feel free to email any of us. And again, what we'll do is we'll aim to reply and respond to those questions, comments in the next webinar, which we hope to have out with you in the next few weeks. With that, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found this interesting and have got some good learnings that you can take back to your organization as to how to cope with this interesting time. Thank you very much.